Father Ian VanHeusen here with Rob Agnelli. We're continuing our commentary on the Soul of the Apostolate. Fill us in. Where are we at in the book? And we'll kind of...
Okay, so we're in the middle now of chapter 3. And the heading of this is the active worker without an interior life.
Yeah.
And so he begins to look at what the apostle will look like when he has no interior life, and what will happen to him when he has no interior life. And he starts off talking about the role of the devil.
Yeah, so get into that. He talks about the devil can tempt us.
Yeah, so what he talks about is how the devil will essentially tempt the person who doesn't have an interior life to move from one good thing to the next. So this sort of flitting from good to good to good, and never really buckling down and actually doing the will of God. So they get into a little apostolate, and then they're like, oh, I had this great idea, and they want to move over to this other thing. And then they leave the thing behind, and there's no awareness of what God wants. It's just, oh, that's good. Oh, I'll do that. That's good.
Why don't we break it down a little bit? Because I think there's two things we could deal with. The idea that the devil can tempt us with what things that appear to be good. Then we can talk about, I think, this whole idea of moving from thing to thing. Let's start with that. I was going to give you an example. Give folks an example. Is with tempted. A lot of times when I'm teaching about discernment of spirits, when I'm teaching people about discernment, I talk about it. This is an easy example that most people actually get wrong initially, but then it's a good example to flesh things out. I say, okay, there's a married person like yourself. Let's take you for example. You have kids that rely on you. You have a career, and you have to provide for them. I say, would it be okay if tomorrow you said to your wife, I feel called to live like St. Francis and to give up all my things and to live like a mendicant and dedicate my life to prayer, fasting, and like a religious. Mm-hmm. And a lot of beginners will say, oh, that's a good thing. That would be a good thing. It's like, no, time out.
Yeah.
No, it would not be a good thing, right? So that's the classic example. Sometimes the devil can get us off track by wanting, so the other one is that a mother would want to have I think it's St. Francis of Sales that says this, a mother who wants to have the prayer life of a Carmelite. That's a real big challenge with a lot of women I've found within the church, is they feel bad about the fact that they can't have the prayer life of a contemplative because they read Teresa of Avila, Therese of Lisieux, and they want to have that same kind of prayer life. And so oftentimes we're tempted when we don't rest in the good that we've been given, and we don't rest in our station in life, and we desire to have somebody else's station in life or somebody else's apostolate.
Yeah, and that sort of restlessness is really because you don't have an interior life, right? Which is what he would be saying, right? Because the person who's rooted in prayer, they know that, okay, I can't live like a monk because I'm a dad, right? Yeah. I can't go, give everything away. It's funny because one of my sons, when he was probably 5 or 6, I had just had surgery, and we had watched a video on St. Francis, one with subtitles or whatever, and he was totally enamored by it. And so the next day I woke up, my wife woke me up, and she goes, Rob, I won't say which one it is because in case he ever sees the video, but she said, he's out in the driveway praying, and he has one of your hooded sweatshirts on. And so he had taken his big hooded sweatshirt, put it over himself, was down to covering his whole body. And she's like, you have to go out and say something to him because he's laying face down in the driveway. And I'm like, okay. And I just had surgery. I'm coming down the step very slowly. And I look out there, and he's laying face down. And I just step out there, and I call his name, and I'm like, I think God wants you to pray on the back porch. Right, so he comes back around the back porch and comes flying back in the house after about 30 seconds. He goes, Dad, God told me that you should give all of your stuff away like St. Francis did. No, so he says, my stuff, right? and I said that, I was like, are you sure you heard that right? Like, maybe he was saying you were supposed to give your stuff away. And he goes, okay, I'll go back and ask him. And he goes back out and he prays, goes back in. And he's like, actually, he said, God said you should give half of your stuff. And I said, well, are you really sure about that? Because half of my stuff is also half of your stuff. Are you prepared for that? Are you sure that that's what God said? And he said, he just kind of looks at me for a second. I said, how about this? I was like, I'm going to the doctor at lunch. we will, if you will go back outside and ask God to put someone in need in our path on the way to the doctor's office, we will take care of that. We'll do whatever that person needs, right? And so he very faithfully goes outside and prays, and of course God delivers, right? Like out of the ears of a child, right? Or out of the mouth of a child. And so we're on the way to the doctor, and we see a homeless guy, and he's like, there he is. And so I pull the car back around. I go into Wendy's. I get us all food. And then I pull up onto the island, and we sit there and eat with the guy, right? And so I'm like all proud as a dad. I'm like, oh yeah, like totally nailed this, right? And I'm like, this is great. And so we get in the car, and he goes, I can't wait to tell Mom. And I'm like, oh, this is my opportunity to nail home the message, like treasure in heaven. I'm like, well, son, like sometimes when you do stuff like that, it's probably better just keep it to yourself. Like just don't tell anyone about it. Just keep it between you and God. And of course, the innocence of the child says, yeah, but if I don't tell anyone, how will they know to do it? Also, right? And I'm like, oh, like the humility of doing awesome. That good thing, right? I was like, you know what, you're totally right. Like, because he would tell people without any guile, right? There was no, and so I think it's sort of illustrative of the idea of flitting from good thing to good thing to good thing, right? Because all of those things were good, but he needed to go back in prayer and really see them clearly, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's a great example. So let's go on to the next point. I hate to end there because sometimes you want to like affirm and build on it, but you're like, that was a good.
Yeah, I mean, So what happens though, right?
I was going to move to the next point. We was talking about moving from good thing to good thing. It's interesting. One of the things they taught us, it's kind of like a leadership management type thing, is that there's kind of like a curve to any new project. There's an initial enthusiasm. My sister tells me as a priest, she has a great insight. She said, as a priest, it comes your second year in apostolate, where you have the dip. Things get hard. I mean, because I've experienced it now with St. Peter's. With most places, when I come in and I'm visiting, they're like, oh, you did so great. We love having you. After a year, they stop doing that. I mean, they still like you. They still love you. They still love what you have to say, but not like you're one of the family.
That's sort of like marriage, too.
Exactly.
You're great. Go take out the trash.
But the thing is there's like a dip where you don't have the same enthusiasm. And the question is, well, why are you doing it? Are you doing it even for the intrinsic war? Are you doing it because it makes you feel good? Or are you doing it because you genuinely felt called to do it? And there's a dip. And then on the other end, there's more reward coming. But yeah. But a lot of people, when they get to that dip, they flee from it because they're searching for that high.
Yeah. When I forget who it was, one of the sort of secular, it might be Jocko Willink. He talks about motivation. Yeah. And he says, like, we think motivation, we think, oh, I have this inner drive to do the thing. And he's like, no, you've wedded yourself to some motive, right? And the dip doesn't come when your motive is the good motive, right? The motive of doing it because God is asking you to do it.
Exactly.
Right. So did you want to say something more about that second point?
Well, I think it's just. I mean, the big thing would be is that you're gonna. I mean, you were saying kind of the dip won't happen, but I think you always experience dry days. But the thing is like it's like the same with a relationship, right? Once you've made a commitment, you have to kind of see it through. And that's one of the things that I don't make a decision in desolation, right? Mm-hmm. Things like that. And that's where I can see most people when they move from thing to thing, they're searching for the high, and they don't have that deeper roots. They're not persevering.
Yeah. So you've said that twice now about not making a decision during desolation. Do you want to talk a little bit more because it fits here, and I think it's a source of confusion for a lot of people.
Yeah. So I mean, the big thing is like what would you think is the confusion?
I think the confusion is they confuse simple things like, oh, when I'm in desolation, I can't decide like where to get my car repaired, or like you know what I mean. Like they forget that it really, when Saint Ignatius says that, is like what he's really saying is don't go back on a resolution you made.
Yes.
When you're in consolation, right?
Yeah, that's it. And
because decisions still have to be like, you need a new car. The car's broken down. You need a car. You're in desolation. You got to make a decision, right?
Yes, yeah. I think we can different categories of decisions, right? I one distinction I make is I call baseball decisions versus golf decisions, right? So like in the category of baseball decisions are like daily things, brushing your teeth, fixing your car, and things like that. And you most of the time you make them without long deliberation, but you make them by a kind of habit, right? So if you're in the habit of being just, of being thoughtful, of being prudent, you don't have to deliberate long and hard and say, well, God, what are you calling me to do? Should I do this or that? Because you're in the habit of doing those things. Most of your daily decisions fall into that. Your golf decisions, where you have time to ponder and think about it, should I marry this person? What's my vocation? Career change? Things like that. Now, I will say, generally speaking, the idea of don't making a decision in desolation, with a lot of things, there's always exceptions. So I was just dealing with this recently. I should have said that. But I mean, if you are in a relationship where it is completely toxic and you are completely depressed and you're at your wit's end, chances are you're never going to experience, you're not going to come to a place of freedom necessarily. Now, what you might need to do, like I would, like in a marriage situation, maybe you need to pull back for a while and discern in a place of freedom where there's a little bit of separation for a season. Maybe you don't make the final decision, but the decision is to remove yourself from the situation or something like that, and to try to ponder it a little bit more. But that's always a tricky thing, because that's always a tricky thing. But the reality is there are some situations that you will not have peace and freedom because you're so worn out and you're so at wit's end, and you just need to remove yourself from the situation. Yeah. Like maybe with a job or something like that.
But all of those things, right? Like what St. Ignatius is talking about is not making decisions to go back on resolutions we already made.
Exactly.
Right?
And so the classic examples.
So it's not just regular decisions; it's stuff that we've already resolved to do.
Exactly. So like, let's say, like in business, that you have committed to starting this business, and you're on year 1 or year 2, is just when it gets hard. I mean, of course, there's always exceptions, but not to go back on the resolution, to stick with it.
Exactly.
And give it its fair amount of time.
Exactly.
And then, of course, with marriage, once you've made that commitment, it's for eternity. Of course, take out the exceptions that we keep talking about. But yeah, and the classic thing I think is for young people, for college students, is because the classic one is you make a commitment to go to a party, you make a commitment to show up to an event, and I mean, and I don't want to guilt college students, but they do this all the time. If you made a commitment to be there, and then the next day you're not feeling too well, or you're a little nervous, you're a little anxious, you need to follow up on your resolution. You need to stick by your commitment.
Yeah, to understand that the devil is working against you to try to not get you to go.
Exactly.
Right? To try to get you not to feel like going, right?
Exactly.
Ultimately. And so sort of tying back to what we were saying, what the flitting, the danger of the flitting from thing to thing to thing to thing is that it creates lukewarmness in us.
Yeah.
Right? And so he goes through what are all the sort of the stages of lukewarmness, which we can talk a little bit about.
And I would say also the one thing that is a key principle with St. Ignatius that is sometimes overlooked is that with our interior life, I love this line from St. Augustine: the mind cannot see itself. And many times you understand your emotions and your thoughts not by just looking inward, but in relation to other people. Your family, your friends, your spiritual director, your confessor. You may not have a spiritual director, but and this is why it's so devastating when somebody doesn't have good friends, when their family is unbalanced, and they have no voices of wisdom, because all in that feedback, they're not accurately able to see what's going on inside.
For sure.
And that's why you need to have good friends, good support network. Because what happens is, what I would tell somebody is, like, if you are in a desolation and you are feeling like you want to exit something, and then everybody around you, assuming that they're healthy relationships, says, I think you're just in a bad place, you just need to wait. You need to listen to those people in your life.
Yeah, and that's one of the rules, right? This is Rule 13. Like when the devil tells you something, like say it out loud, right? And he flees.
Exactly.
And he flees. So before we close, let's talk a little bit about lukewarmness.
Yeah.
And just the danger of it, right? And he has a really cool way of, because busyness can often make us lukewarm, right?
Yeah.
Because what happens is we make when you're busy, you spend a lot of you have these good desires, but you don't have any habit of putting them into practice, right? And so that's like the first step in the process of lukewarmness, is when you're really you express desire, but you don't really do anything about it, right? So like, I know that, I need to stop gossiping, but I don't put real things in place to stop gossiping, right? Like, I don't examine myself at the end of the day about my gossiping, whatever, right? And so the danger in keeping ourselves busy is that it opens the path for lukewarmness. And we talked about how like God works, right, in this natural progression, and that what the devil has to do is always reverses what God does. At a certain point in our lives, right, the devil isn't just going to tempt you to go do this mortal sin, right? He's got to move you into position where now that thing looks appealing, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a stage where you grow a certain amount where you now have to pass through the stage of lukewarmness to get over where the devil really gets his grip in you. And so he's just as satisfied moving you to lukewarmness than tempting you to do something horrible, right?
Yeah, go through this, walk us through.
Yeah, so he says, okay, the first, which is what we sort of already talked about, is a loss of clarity and convictions of the interior life, right? So this, again, having the perseverance to make good resolutions and actually put them into play.
I was thinking about this in my own life. One of the temptations is, for ministry, it's like almost like a buzzword. You got to be relevant, right? So don't spend too much time in prayer, you won't become relevant. People would say that.
Yeah.
Like, if you spend too much time in prayer, you won't become relevant. You got to like be more in the world so that you can relate to people. Which of course false. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. And so just to back up, so knowing these stages, right? If you can identify them, that's how you step out, right? So if I notice a couple of days after my mental prayer that I have no resolutions, or that it's just vague. I'm vaguely, meditating on the virtues of Christ and not really thinking about how that's a sign that lukewarmness is around the corner.
Or maybe you're making a little bit front brain, but if there's not growth, if you're not seeing growth.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, fair enough. Okay, so the first is.
If you're experiencing contemplation or a season of more rested state, you may not be making firm resolutions.
Yeah, exactly. So the normal state of like mental prayer, where you have discursive and all of that. Yes, for sure. Second stage, he says, is we become greedy of the time devoted to the active life and fails to live by a schedule in his interior life. And his point is, when we sense in prayer that we're in a rush, right? We're in a rush to get out of prayer so that we can go do the stuff we have to do. That's a sign, right? That's a sign that we actually probably should spend a little more time in prayer.
Yeah.
Like fighting that temptation, right? And the other thing too that he says is, and I think you and I have talked about this before, but my prayer life changed when I actually put it front and center in my life, in the sense of like, I would go to bed at night way too late. And so I'd get up and I'd be falling asleep when I was praying, right?
Yeah.
And when I finally clicked with me that, you know what, like, you're staying up late, and I wasn't doing anything wrong, right? I was just wasting time, maybe watching something or, and when I actually said, this is actually affecting my prayer life, I'm going to bed. Right? Like, I'm going to live a normal human life where you get a certain amount of sleep. My prayer life got so much better, right? So I had to accept my limitation that, I can't not sleep. But, that putting the prayer life front and center, I think, is what he's talking about, right? So I was having room then for lukewarmness, just simply for my habits,
makes
right?
sense.
Because that's not a prayerful habit. And then he says stage three, he talks about praying your breviary, although it fits with any of your other prayer commitments, right?
Like a formal structure prayer that you have a commitment to.
So like daily rosary, daily Divine Mercy Chaplet, whatever, right? When he says, when you either drop those things, or like you keep putting them off. So like at 3:00 I'm going to pray the Divine Mercy Chaplet.
Mhm.
When I keep putting it off, until 3:59, he's like, that's a sign that lukewarmness is like you're immersed in it,
Yeah.
right? Because the call to prayer came at 3:00.
Yeah.
And you should go, and
Well, I think St. John the Cross really builds on this in the nada section. He says, one of the things I've tried to focus on with prayer and with other things is not putting things off. And he has this idea when you it's in the third part. I almost want to look it up, where it's like if you delay in something, you cease to rush towards the all. To go from all to all, deny yourself of all in all. And what I find in this little way that I've been working on, both in the active life and in the interior life, is there'll be a desire to delay. And what taught me not to give into that desire delay is having my dog. Because the beauty of dogs is there is no delay. You can't you once they want your attention,
yeah,
and they need your attention for a physical need, you can't teach a dog to delay for 5 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's either then or never,
Yeah.
right? It's either yes or no.
yeah. Kids are the same way.
Yeah.
kids are the same way.
Exactly. And so it's interesting that we have to be the same way sometimes with our prayer life, because what our tendency will be is to delay for a little bit. And I can see this with a lot of people where, let me watch YouTube for 5 minutes and then I'll pray the rosary.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just delay a little bit. And when we don't give into that delay a little bit and we move immediately, over time, it's a lot of little things like that.
Yeah, well, that call to prayer, the prayer is a gift. It's not something that I initiate, right? And in a certain sense, the ignoring of the call
Mm-hmm.
is really like me saying no to God,
Yeah.
right? Like, no, not right now. Like,
Yeah.
just give me a couple more minutes.
Exactly. And our will constantly has a repugnance towards those things that are best for us. And that's the concept of adre contra, to work against. We'll often have a momentary repugnance towards things that we ought to do.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and again, it goes back to, tying back to discernment of spirits, right? Like, which spirit is the one telling you wait to pray,
Exactly.
right? And so the minute you identify the evil spirit, you do the exact opposite of what he's telling you to do, right?
One of the reasons, I'm not saying that everybody has to do this, but one of the things that I recently found as a trap, and I moved it in my apartment, I didn't get rid of it completely, was having a lazy boy. I didn't have a lazy boy. I have just like a recliner.
Mm-hmm.
My mornings and my days have gotten so much better. I put the recliner in the guest room. And so now I do not have a comfortable chair to lay down on. And I for a while I had a couch in my office that I would lay down on, and my productivity keeps getting so much better because I just don't have, it's either I take a nap or I'm sitting in a stiff chair.
Yeah.
There's no middle ground, right?
Yeah, that discipline of just sitting up straight. It's a simple thing, right? Like,
But what the middle ground was, the lazy chair was, well, I'm not committing to taking a nap, but I'll just lay back for like 10, 15 minutes. And I'll just kind of close my eyes and just lay back for 10, 15 minutes in the morning. It's like, well, now it's like I'm either sleeping, laying down for a nap, or I'm sitting upright. And sometimes now it's made it more clear in my mind. I'm like, okay, I do need to take a nap.
mm-hmm.
I'll take a nap.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so stage 4, which is the last part he talks about, he says, a familiarity without respect, routine, maybe even repugnance are lying in wait for him now. And what he means by this is that everything in the spiritual life starts to become routine, and he talks especially about the sacraments.
Yeah.
Where you begin to take the sacraments, almost in a sense of maybe even beyond routine. You're just, you give or take. You're like, it's okay. Daily mass, I could, I could go or not go. Or confession, I could wait till next week. And he said at that stage is like now the battle is fully engaged, and you're just a step away from the lukewarmness that Christ talks about that makes him sick in the Book of Revelation. Right?
And where I would add a word of caution with how to understand this properly is, so there are stages where your emotions are not activated in a positive way. So like for me, there was like a certain learning curve of the Mass where there's certain seasons where my experience of the Mass and my experience of the sacraments is very dry.
Mm-hmm.
But what I would say is, going with that adre contra, if you're experiencing this where your experience of the sacraments and experience of the obligations of religion are dry, is to increase your external piety in those moments. So like like if you're feeling repugnance, like with Mass, and you're just feeling dryness, come early and kneel. And like even like I mean sometimes like something as simple as like I found if I'm feeling dryness like with prayer, to kneel and maybe raise my hands a little bit if it's private or something like that, is even though it's like my physical body is expressing the opposite of what I'm experiencing interior, but by doing that, the emotions will follow in a certain regard.
Yeah, well, because you're training, you're using your body to train the emotions, right?
Exactly.
Training, and it's important in those moments.
So that might surprise people. If you see Father Ian kneeling and raising his hands in prayer, I may not be actually feeling anything positive.
Yeah, for sure. But so, like it's also important in those moments to make, when it's dry, especially, before every Mass, I make an act of desire, right? Yeah. That Christ earnestly desired to give this to us, give himself to me, right? And I make acts of desire, even though a lot of times I don't feel like it, right? Yeah. Because at the very least, I can express my desire even if it's not felt.
Well, and that's the choice is what defines you.
Yes.
Also.
Yeah.
Because the passions, the emotions are kind of received and they're kind of neutral. And of course, according to St. Ignatius, sometimes God removes those signals to give you the opportunity to exercise your will.
Yeah.
Like, because ultimately, the saints have all said this. When you make a choice for devotion in times when you don't feel like it and you feel dry, that is more meritorious.
Yeah. Because you're not getting the boost from the emotions, right? Like
exactly.
Yeah, and I think it's important while we're talking about this, just to understand.
You need to have good emotions. If it's always dry, maybe you might have something like chronic depression, which actually St. John the Cross deals with. He does talk about what we would call chronic depression. If you look it up in his sections where he talks about melancholy, that there could be like a legitimate biological component that you need a medication for.
Yeah, and I think the other part is like...
And they would have understood medication. It would have been herbs and things like that.
Yeah. If you're not experiencing those, you can ask God to give them to you, right? Like there's nothing. It's funny. People don't. They're like, wait, I can pray for proper emotions. Yeah. Yeah. Because Christ redeemed your emotions. Like there they are, right there, right?
Exactly. But yeah, I think that's a good place to end. So this is our next segment for Soul of the Apostolate. Keep following us as we do this commentary. Right. Thanks, Rob.